Hi everybody, welcome to week 4, and this week we're going to be talking about something called the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats or challenges. So some people call this a SWOT analysis and some people call it a SWOC analysis. And what I want you to notice is that I've given you a lot of readings to do in the week 4 area of items you must do, but really they're not that incredibly long. I gave you the Bryson text, chapter 4, and then a reading that I attached by Bryson and Alston. And so I just need to give you a heads up on that one. It didn't copy correctly on the PDF. When you click on it, right click and hit rotate clockwise and it should work for you. But I also gave you some examples of SWOT or SWOC analyses that you can look at, and all that's going to lead up to the discussion board this week where we're going to do one. So let me move right into that. So first of all, I want to talk about last week when we talked about this idea of stakeholders. And this is an example of when I've done this exercise before with Metro Transit, coming up with who are stakeholders. And I wanted to look at some of the thinking that we had in the discussion. So subjects, a lot of people said that writers were subjects. That is, that they're users of the system and they're the most impacted by changes, but they have little power to affect change. That may or may not be completely factual, but in fact, the writers probably do have the least power, and they probably have the most interest in the system. Some people said the players included people like the mayor of Omaha. And the mayor of Omaha has some play in Metro, although Metro gets a lot of its funding from the federal government. Let me look at a couple other examples from this chart. So some people said customers are in the crowd. I thought that was interesting. So that's riders who are in the crowd. They have low interest and low power. Some people put the mayor of Omaha in context setters because, for example, the mayor has city ordinances and the metro company has to abide by those city ordinances. So the reason I showed you these from the discussion last week is that it's not necessarily cut and dried. When you're trying to figure out who the stakeholders are in your organization, it's not always going to be obvious. And this speaks to one of the reasons when we do strategic planning, we'd like to get involvement from all areas of the organization internally, and we'd like to be able to successfully identify external stakeholders. To do that probably requires some brainstorming and some commitment of time. And so I wanted to show you these examples that defining the stakeholders and what they bring to the table, the interest they have and the power they have, it's not always necessarily obvious. And that could affect the way you develop your strategic plan. So this week, what we're getting at is we're switching gears and we're getting to analyzing the environment. And so this is part of step 4 of Bryson's 10-step model. You might want to turn to your textbook again on pages 44 and 45 and look at the 10-step model. But part of analyzing the environment is understanding what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, what our opportunities are, and what our challenges are. And so this week I'm going to take you through something called this SWOT exercise or SWOC exercise. This is something that a lot of organizations do when they first start their strategic planning effort. And really it's a very useful tool to get people talking. If you gather a lot of people from the organization in the room, this is a really useful tool to use to get people discussing what's really what they consider to be good and bad about the organization. So Bryson goes into some detail on pages 160 through 165 about how our environment is changing. I'm not necessarily talking about our natural environment here. I'm talking about the environment in which organizations operate. And so we've talked a little bit about this, the idea of social and organizational complexity. Actually, you can see that all around you, how organizations are changing and morphing right before our eyes. And really, organizations come in all different sizes and shapes, and it's getting to be a complex environment. The second point, reform and redirection of governments and increased interaction among public, private, and nonprofit sectors. This is a very real environmental change in our world. It's no longer possible, really, to say that government does this, nonprofit does that, the for-profit sector does this other thing. Really, in fact, we are in this era of governance where all these sectors interchange and interact with each other. So, for example, even in a typical city, if we look at issues as basic as trash collection, we're seeing interaction between governments and for-profit sectors. If we look at issues like how do we house homeless people, we're looking at interactions between governments and nonprofits and for-profits. And so that it's very difficult to necessarily say this is the job of government, or this is the job of a nonprofit, or this is the job of a for-profit sector. Technological change, we are all very familiar with that, especially social media and its impact on how our work gets done. Diversity of our workforce, our clientele, and our citizenry, we spent some time talking about that. We spent some time talking about a lot of these things, and we can go on with these environmental changes, but I think you get the point. Right now during this 2016 election cycle, I think we're looking at these two things right here, and there are some vastly different answers being put forward by different candidates on how we deal with these things. So suffice to say, the environment is changing, and that's why as an organization you have to understand it. So why do we worry about this stuff, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges? So look at this 2x2 table here, and we see strengths up here, weaknesses up here, opportunities down here, and challenges down here. So strengths are these things that we do well. Weaknesses are things we don't do so well. Opportunities are things, just what it sounds like, opportunities for us to grow, and challenges or threats might be things that might get in our way. But how do all these things relate to each other? Let me show you a couple ways they relate to each other. I'm very sorry I keep doing that. Challenges could also be very future looking. So when we're talking about environment, we're talking about the difference between internal and external and present and future. And then finally, the third thing is we're talking about the difference between positive and negative, right? So generally we would think of strengths as being positive and opportunities as being positive, and then we think of weaknesses as being negative and challenges as being negative. So there's this three-way tension between these four elements. They don't exist in a vacuum. They are related to each other. So let's talk about this idea of an internal environment versus an external environment. So here's on this top row is internally, and then here's externally. So internally, we have resources in our organization, which consist of people, our economic health inside the organization, our information capabilities, our relative competitiveness, and our internal culture. We have present strategies. We may have strategies overall by the organization, by department, by process, by function. And we haven't talked about this very much, but we're going to talk more in the coming weeks about this thing called a balanced scorecard. But that's just one example of performance. So every organization really should be measuring its performance somehow. So what are the indicators that your organization looks at? I mean, if I have a food bank, I may be looking at the number of meals I distribute per week. I may be looking at the number of meals per $1 I can distribute, or per $10 that I can distribute per week. I may be looking at results or history. If I own a museum and it's a nonprofit, an art museum for example, I may be looking at the number of patrons that come through the door and tour the museum in a week's time or a month's time. I might be looking at the number of memberships to my museum that I can sell. So every organization has some kind of performance indicators. If they don't, how do they know what they're doing? And then there's the external environment. So here we start talking about some of the things that we really might not have control over in our organization. So for example, political forces and trends, economic forces, social forces. You know, I referred to the educational system and its impact on our organizations. We may have key resource controllers like clients, customers, payers, or funders, but all these are really external to us. Remember we said, you know, if I own this museum, I might have an indicator that says how many people come through the door and pay to tour my museum, but really, do I have control over their choices? I might have some control in my marketing to try to get them to come through the door, but ultimately they're making that decision, so it's external to me. And then competitors and collaborators. So even in the nonprofit and for government or government world, we have competitors and we have collaborators. You know, so who are they? And what are the competitive forces? And who are our collaborators? And what are the collaborative forces? And you have to be thinking about all these things when you're thinking about the environment. So I don't know if I promised in advance, but I should have said this is going to be a short lecture because I really want to launch you on this exercise for this week. So first of all, do all the assigned readings. If you look at the week 4 required readings, you're going to see a whole list and maybe panic, but rest assured a lot of them are really just good examples, or maybe not great examples of SWOT exercises that organizations have done. But do concentrate on the readings from the Bryson text and the Bryson and Alston text. The Bryson and Alston text is that handbook I told you about. It has a really good example of a SWOT exercise. And then after you do all those readings, I want you to look at this link that I have right here. This happens to be the strategic plan for our own university, the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I want you to spend some time looking at not just UNO's strategic plan, but take some time to look at UNO's entire website. I'm sure most of you have looked at it, but I want you to spend some in-depth time looking at it. And then what I want you to do for this week's exercise, go to the weekly discussion board, and here's what I've assigned you to do. I want you to develop a SWOT. So I want you to come up with at least 2 strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats or challenges for UNO, for our university. And then what I want you to do is I want you to justify each of those in your discussion. So basically you're going to have at least 8 paragraphs. You're going to have 2 strengths and a paragraph for each, why you justify those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges for each of those. So that is this week's discussion board. So finally, some upcoming events. You just turned in your term paper proposals to me. Coming up on September 24th is our first short analysis essay, and that is a stakeholder analysis. So as promised, we're going to reinforce a lot of this stuff. We did a stakeholder analysis in our discussion board last week, and I'm going to have you write a stakeholder analysis for this first short analysis, and you can find that at the assignments tab, so please do be looking at that. On October 8th, I have your term project interview plan coming up. We are going to spend at least 1 week talking about interviews and coming up with interview questions. And then following that, there's 3 more written assignments after the interview plan. So the discussion is proceeding apace. As always, please do email me questions and concerns you have. I can't help you with your concerns unless you let me know what they are. So thanks for your participation thus far, and I look forward to our SWOT exercise this week. Thank you.